I want to welcome everyone to this international conference on the material and visual culture of Sogdiana. It's an event that is co-sponsored by the Collège de France in Paris, the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU, and the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies. I'm particularly grateful to my co-organizers, Soren Stark and Frans Grenet, whose vision and efforts have really made this program possible. A heartfelt thanks to all of our presenters, particularly those who traveled here despite the increasingly difficult political climate. There's plenty I'd like to say. Some of it unprintable, some of it of the four-letter variety about the state of things in the U.S. right now. But then I think of Gitti. Advice, stay firm in your convictions, but choose your moments of public expression wisely. So I'm choosing to adhere to her advice. A most heartfelt and special welcome is reserved for Vesa Beckham and Theo. Vesa is the daughter of the late Professor Gitti Azepe, to whom this conference is dedicated. Among the many subjects that shaped Professor Azepe's distinguished scholarly career, the art and culture of Sogdiana held a special place. So most of us here were privileged to know Gitti Azepe personally, whether as a mentor, a colleague, teacher, or a dear friend. Some had the great fortune to accompany her in the field. Others encountered her through her extensive body of scholarship. Yet, regardless of the nature of our connections, all of us, or most of us in this room, I think, have been touched by the legacy of her intellectual contributions and her personability that really shaped her interactions within the scholarly community. Professor Azepe lived an extraordinary life, one that defies easy summary, so I'm not going to try here. She was born in Tehran. Her early years were marked by movement and transformation. The family relocated to the US from Iran in the 1950s. She received a secondary education in England, and upon her return to the United States, she pursued her higher education at the University of California, Berkeley, completing her PhD in art history in the 1960s, and beginning what would become a pioneering and influential career at the very institution where she trained. Now, over 4 decades of teaching at Berkeley, she distinguished herself not only through her groundbreaking scholarship, but also through her unwavering commitment to her students and her fortitude in navigating and confronting the gendered barriers of academia that persisted throughout the 20th century and even, I would say, linger today. As a faculty member in the Department of Near Eastern Studies, now known as the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures, Gitti helped cultivate a dynamic intellectual community dedicated to the study of the ancient Iranian and Central Asian worlds. Working alongside esteemed colleagues, one of whom was not here yet, Martin Schwartz and the late Professor David Stronach, she left an indelible mark on the field and on generations of students at UC Berkeley and beyond. I myself have very cherished memories of Gitti from my time as a graduate student at Berkeley in the early 1990s. In fact, she was the very first person I met on campus when I was exploring the possibility of graduate student studies here, coming from the Rijksuniversity of Leiden in the Netherlands. She welcomed me with her signature warmth and good humor, radiant smile, distinctive laugh, and offered exactly the kind of measured encouragement and grounded wisdom that would sustain really so many of us through the rigors of academic life. And there are a number of generations of students present here today. As a scholar, Professor Azepe was internationally known for her studies on the visual cultures of the Iranian and Central Asian worlds. Her research extended across traditions and eras: Sasanian, Sogdian, Buddhist, Manichaean, Zoroastrian, Urartian, Persian. And she was particularly known for her meticulous attention to iconography, materiality, and the intersection of artistic and religious forms. Her work brought to light the richly textured worlds of the medieval Middle East and Central Asia and helped reframe them within the broader conversations on cultural transmission, religious pluralism, and visual narrative. Her 1981 monograph, Sogdian Painting, the pictorial epic in Oriental art, remains a landmark publication in the field for a number of reasons. It brought deserved attention to the seminal contributions of Soviet-era scholars, such as Alexander Belenitsky, Boris Marshak, particularly regarding the murals of Penjikent, while also advancing her own critical insights into the subject matter, iconographic structures, and formal innovations of Sogdian painting. While the achievements of Soviet archaeologists and art historians were well known across Europe, it was really Gitti's work that helped introduce and elevate the significance of Sogdian art to Anglophone audiences, particularly here in the United States, where the Sogdians began to take their rightful place in the broader study of Iranian visual and religious culture. Now, her scholarship was always marked by interdisciplinary rigor, drawing upon the methodologies of art history, religious studies, philology, and archaeology to reconstruct the intellectual and aesthetic landscapes of the Silk Road. In doing so, she exemplified a model of cross-disciplinary scholarship that continues to shape Eurasian studies today. Her work was recognized by numerous institutions, including fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Philosophical Society, as well as long-standing involvement in the American Institute of Archaeology, the American Oriental Society, and the Asia Institute. In later years, she was honored with the Albert Nelson Marquis Lifetime Achievement Award in recognition of her enduring impact on the field. She also served as advisor to the Society for Asian Art and the Asian Art Museum, and in fact, she was the one who introduced me to their work, a relationship that has continued up to the present. Her impact extended beyond her teaching and professional activities. At UC Berkeley, she was instrumental in the development of two significant research collections. The Pahlavi Archive, housed in the Bancroft Library, which Adam Bencato will speak to briefly in a minute, and the corpus of ancient seals, particularly Sasanian, which had been donated by Edward Gans to the Department of Near Eastern Studies. And these resources have shaped the work of countless students here and continue to be central to departmental research today. Approximately a decade ago, I think, I'm not sure of the exact date, but Gitti also established an endowment in support of Iranian studies at UC Berkeley. In her eyes, the creation of this fund was a logical step in the long-standing commitment of UC Berkeley to Iranian studies, invoking the legacy of Walter Bruno Henning, one of the 20th century's preeminent scholars of Middle Iranian languages and literature. That endowment has since made possible the regular appointment of a Gitti Azapeh Distinguished Visitor in the Arts of Iran and Central Asia, ensuring that the field she so deeply cared about will continue to thrive. Now, in my own efforts to promote Silk Road studies at Berkeley over the decades, Gitti remained a steady presence, offering encouragement, advice, and genuine curiosity about every new project. I was deeply moved that she lived to see the founding of the P.Y. and Kim May W. Tang Center for Silk Road Studies in 2017, and that she took part in its early events. She was very quietly delighted by the work of her students and their students in turn. Even as her health declined, she would, from time to time, call my home, simply to ask what's going on, inquiring with unflagging interest about both professional undertakings and family life. So I think it's fitting then that this conference not only gathers scholars to engage with Sogdian material and visual culture, but does so in memory of one who helped shape the foundations for its study. Now, my colleague, Surur Hanimati, I don't know whether she's here already, who traveled to with Gitti through Iran, will close the conference on Saturday afternoon with a more personal tribute, sharing memories of Gitti that go beyond the walls of the department and into the life outside academia. So Now what rests me is to turn briefly to the aims, at least from my perspective, of this weekend's program. This conference, and there's also a private closed-door workshop that follows on Sunday, grew out of an interest for a more comprehensive, accessible, interdisciplinary source, i.e. a book, on ancient and medieval Sogdiana. But the question and the discussion, of course, centers on what would that entail. In scholarly discourse on the Silk Road, the Sogdians have often served as a symbol for cultural hybridity and trans-regional connectivity. As merchants, religious intermediaries, urban elites, political negotiators, they appear in varying historical and geographic contexts. Yet for all the attention they have garnered, a central question continues to perhaps elude consensus, important in thinking about a volume on Sogdiana. How can we meaningfully speak of a Sogdian identity or a cohesive Sogdian cultural environment that could be, central to a book? So this conference engages with that question, not just, not to seek a definitive answer on this, but to highlight the processes, performances, and politics through which Sogdianness may have been articulated, claimed, contested, and Sogdianness in quotation mark. Rather than assuming the existence of a fixed or homogeneous Sogdian identity, we might examine where Sogdian identity can be located, how it was shaped by networks, institutions, languages, religions, and material culture in multiple and maybe even to some degree contradictory ways. Thinking about, the label Sogdian, and the challenges with that. Is it a geographic label referring to the region of Sogdiana, with what is contained in that region? How is its extent then defined? Is it a marker of quote unquote ethnic identity, referring to descent or some type of cultural continuity? Is it primarily a linguistic designation referring to speakers of the Sogdian language, regardless of location or background? So there are a number of, and throughout this conference, I think speakers will address a number of these issues, questions circulating around language, questions circulating around religions. So hopefully, at some point we'll have a very fruitful conversation on how to put a cohesive volume together. And I want to just say that this is a Tang Center for Silk Road Studies project, a series of books on the various oases of the Silk Road. And in fact, Monica Zinn and Satomi Hiyama are currently working on a volume on Kucha, which is also not very easy, to kind of bring together in a cohesive volume that deals with history, language, religion, art, archaeology, etc. And we're hoping, if we can come to a consensus, that would also work for a UC Press publication on Sogdiana as well. So that's our aim. And hopefully it will be a very exciting and very lively discussion. But I'm not going to take more of your time. I would like to introduce to you the chair of the first session, the morning session, Professor Adam Benkato. Adam is the Bita Daryabari Presidential Chair in Iranian Studies in our department, the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures. He's a specialist on the Sogdian language and on Sogdiana, among many other things, also too many to mention here. So it's only apt that he would launch this conference. So please help me welcome Adam Benkato.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I think most of you know me already, but for those who didn't, you just heard who I was, I guess. I just wanted to also reflect briefly on Gitti Azarpeh, and then we'll proceed to the 3 papers that we have scheduled for this morning. Of course, as a graduate student focusing on Sogdian, I was well familiar with Gitti's works, even though I was trained as a philologist and not as a specialist of material and visual culture. But of course, she was one of the icons of Sogdian studies. So it was quite nice that when I arrived here, I was able to, I had the pleasure to meet Gitti a few times and talk about Sogdian things. And it was even nicer that, on occasion I would send her an email with a random question about something, and even though she had long been retired and was no longer in good health, she would still reply, sharing what she knew or could remember. But I actually was not really familiar with sort of one of her other major legacies until I really got settled here and started working on the Bancroft Library's collection of Middle Persian documents dating to the early Islamic era, which is actually the largest accessible collection of Middle Persian documents in the world, and sealings, or bullae, which Gitti was instrumental in acquiring and initiating research on in the early 2000s. And so if it wasn't for her work to have the Bancroft Library acquire that collection and to begin inviting scholars from around the world to begin working on it, including the two foremost authorities of Middle Persian documents, the late Philippe Gignoux and Dieter Weber, then this, the field of documentary Middle Persian would sort of not nearly be in the shape that it is today. This collection is ambiguously named the Pahlavi Archive, but of course there's many such Pahlavi archives. Berkeley's is just the largest. Yeah, we can talk about those details if you're interested. So without further ado, I think we proceed to the first paper of this morning. We have about 30 minutes for the presentation, and then after each presentation we'll do some questions and hopefully answers. Is it three? No, yeah, 3 papers this morning. And then I will give you, the speakers, some time warnings as we get closer to the end of your allotted 30 minutes. So yeah, for our first presentation this morning, please help me welcome Professor Søren Stark from the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU, presenting on new archaeological data on the history of Bukhara between the Achaemenid and Karakhanid periods, early 4th century BCE to early 13th century CE.
Welcome, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank. I would like to extend again my gratitude to my co-organizers, Sanchot and Franz, for making this possible. I would like to also express my gratitude with regard to the topic that I'm presenting to my colleagues and friends Jamal and Siroj Mirza Akhmedov and to Asan Targoyev for their collaboration and for their support. All of what I am presenting today is the result of collaborative work, and it is first and foremost thanks to them that we are now approaching the opportunity to write a systematic and nuanced early history of this important city on the basis of archaeological data. What I am going to do today is something, of course, of much more modest character. I would simply like to give you some preliminary impressions of some of our most important archaeological data stemming from 5 seasons of excavations carried out since 2020 under the auspices of the Uzbek-American expedition in the city center of Bukhara, which is a collaboration between the Samarkand Institute of Archaeology, represented by my colleague and friend Jamal Mirza Akhmedov, and NYU's Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. It is, of course, very well known that compared to other major cities in the wider region, such as Merv and Samarkand, the archaeological exploration of Bukhara lags considerably behind. And this is mainly due to what you see here on the slide, because unlike Samarkand and Merv, for example, the present-day city of Bukhara stills very much on the same spot as it was during antiquity and the Middle Ages. Although that does, of course, not mean that no excavations were carried out in Bukhara. In fact, the history goes back almost 100 years, with the first excavations conducted by Vasily Shishkin in 1934. And these works were intermittently continued and conducted throughout the Soviet period, but much of this remained either very small in scale and or remained insufficiently documented and published. And in addition, and this is of course something that is true for many sites in the wider region, layers dating to antique period layers of the history of the city are notoriously difficult to reach. They are covered by many meters of later deposits, while the very earliest occupation strata, as we know, they are buried often below the present-day water table. So this gap of knowledge is now being filled by these ongoing excavations in the very city center at an exceptionally prominent spot just to the north of the present-day Congregational Mosque. It's an area of about 1.7 hectares, which was until the early 90s the spot of a farmer's bazaar and then was turned into a modest tourist bazaar. This tourist bazaar was torn down in 2018, which offered the chance to conduct excavations at this really important spot. These excavations were started in 2018 by Jamal Mirza Akhmedov and continued in 2019 by an Uzbek and an Uzbek-French team co-directed by Jamal Mirza Akhmedov and Rocco Rante. And I was invited by Jamal Mirza Akhmedov to join this effort in 2020. Now, why is this area so important? Let me briefly explain the main components of the topography of the old city. The late pre- and the early Islamic settlement consisted, as it is well known, of three parts. The citadel, the old inner city, called Shahristan or Hisar-i Darun or Medina in medieval sources, and the suburbs. Obviously, in order to understand the early history of the settlement in this area, one needs to understand in particular the development of the citadel and the old city. Now, the citadel has been intermittently the subject of investigations since 1968, and then especially in the 1970s and more recently by an Uzbek-French team. But these investigations are hampered by the existence, and you can see that nicely here in the profiles, by the existence of cultural layers amounting to a total of 18 meters. And as a consequence, all we get from the lower strata are only tiny little 1-to-1 or 2-to-2 meter snapshots. Therefore, the old inner city, the Shahristan, is in principle a much more promising area to investigate. Although, as you will see, the cultural package is with about 8 to 9 meters below the present-day surface and up to the water table, still considerable. Now, fortunately, we do have a basic understanding of where the old city was situated, because on the one hand, you can see that here it clearly shows on the contour map, and several 10 to 12th century sources, such as the Tarikh-i Bukhara, of course, and the geographers of the 10th century, they give us a fairly good basic understanding about the general configuration of the old city, so roughly between the 8th and the 12th centuries. We know that by the time of the Arab conquest, Bukhara, which is the beginning of the 8th century, the inner city was surrounded by its own city wall, which was separated from the citadel but connected to it via a viaduct. We also know that the layout of the inner city was somewhat regular, pointing at some planned foundation maybe of the city. There was a main east-west thoroughfare, which was intersected at an approximately 90-degree angle in the very city center by a north-south running thoroughfare. In the south, beyond the southern city gate, was the main freshwater course, the Shahrud, and between the Shahrud and the bazaar gate in the southern city wall was a large bazaar area of suburban character. Now, for earlier periods, so before the 8th century, written documentation is entirely lacking. So all we have is archaeology. What makes this particular spot, marked here on the slides, so special is that it is right next to a number of features of great importance for a better understanding of the city's development and history. On the one hand, it is next to one of the early settlement cores, a little elevation, a little hill that is considered to be one of the old cores of settlement. That's why it is a little higher in the topography. It is also located right next to this main east-west thoroughfare, and this area covers the area where we would expect the western city wall system. So, what have we learned in the last 5 years? Now, before I want to go into the details in a roughly chronological order, I would like to point out that up to now, 29 radiocarbon samples were successfully processed in 3 different laboratories, and these are the very first radiocarbon dates ever obtained from archaeological contexts in the area of the Shahristan of Bukhara, as opposed to the citadel, from which recently dates have been published by the Uzbek French team. As you can see, our sampling strategy was focused on pre-10th century contexts, also as opposed to the sampling strategy for dates from the citadel and other sites outside in the oasis published by the Uzbek French team. Of these 29 successful samples, only 1 represents a short-lived seed, a barley seed. So the rest are charcoal samples, and that means old wood effects cannot be excluded. It should also be noted that that none of the received calibrated dates that you see here have been subjected to Bayesian modeling, which is planned for a future stage of investigation and might result in more precise dates. But this is, I think, a first important step. So, the very earliest strata that we've reached by coring about 1.5 meter deep below the water table in a stratigraphic sondage excavated down to the water table at around 9 meters below the present day surface. So this whole strata is at a total depth of 10.5 meters below the surface. We hit in the core a cultural layer with ash and charcoal, and this apparently dates to the late Achaemenid period. So I think we can confidently say that there must have been a settlement in Bukhara at least since the beginning of, or the first half of the 4th century BCE. Unfortunately, because this comes from below the water table, was not really excavated, we know nothing about the character of this settlement because, as I said, it is now deep in the groundwater. Fortunately, that changes with the following period, the Hellenistic period. Now, to our great surprise, at a level of about 3.5 meters below the present-day surface, we encountered a monumental fortification in form of a tower, probably a corner tower, and a curtain wall. Immediately to the south of the fortress ran a watercourse. Unfortunately, already in antiquity, the fortifications were raised below the floor levels, so we have no material directly dating these fortifications. All that we can conclude from the architecture itself, and that is mostly the mud brick formats, is that it must date sometime between, let's say, the early 3rd century BCE and the late 1st or 2nd century CE. However, we found a pit house and a slightly later storage dug directly into this earlier fortification walls. And these pits can be dated to the second half of the 2nd century BCE and the first half of the 1st century BCE. So this wall must be older, probably as old as the 3rd century BCE. And this is when 2 more pieces of the puzzle come into the picture, namely a fragment of a fishbowl and a pyramidal loom weight. They were not found inside the fortifications. They were found at the very bottom of the stratigraphic trench, which is, you see that here, area 5, located outside of this area. These 2 finds, I think, point to the presence of settler families from the Mediterranean during the first half of the 3rd century BCE, because fishbowls with a central indentation suggest non-local dining habits, and this pyramidal loom weight is a very characteristic innovation brought to Central Asia only with the Macedonian armies, or more specifically, because textile production was a domestic craft, with women from the Mediterranean. And that's why we see the distribution of such pyramidal loom weights exactly in areas where we know that there was a substantial settler presence during the early Seleucid period, notably in Bactria, in Margiana, and in other metropolitan areas in Sogdiana. So in all likelihood, our 3rd century fortification in Bukhara are the remains of a Seleucid colony at the spot of an earlier Achaemenid period settlement of yet unknown character. Now there are indications of a repair phase of the fortress at some point during the 1st century BCE, perhaps towards the middle of that century. During the second half of the 1st century BCE, or during the beginning of the 1st century CE, life in the fortress is attested in form of another pit house, a large storage vessel, and a tandir. Later, so at some point really during the 1st century CE, our excavated area inside the fortress was used as a massive waste dump, which was very rich in ceramics and in animal bones. The ceramics are dominated by high-stamped goblets, but particularly interesting, I think, is this really large corpus of animal bones, and these animal bones are currently studied by Noel Amano from the Max Planck Institute in Jena, and this corpus really promises us to tell us a lot more about things like herd composition, herd management, life ways, and consumption patterns. Most likely, the fortress was no longer functioning at this time because a sandy desolation layer immediately above the repair masonry of the tower contained several such high-stamped goblets, but no later ceramics. Outside the fortress, in this stratigraphic trench, 6 to 6 meters, that I mentioned earlier, we have a similar picture. A number of temporary hearths and a lot of ceramic and animal waste dating to the 1st century CE, and then below, a production area with imprints of homes and an iron smelting furnace, a small one, probably dating to the 1st century BCE. In all likelihood, this area was then situated, again, outside the fortress, whether it still existed or not, but near the shores of some water body, a lake or a swamp. So what happened next? That's one of the big questions. Judging from our radiocarbon dates, I think it seems that we currently have a tiny bit of a hiatus of about half a century. It seems to fall into the very end of the 1st or the 1st half of the 2nd century, although given that almost all of our samples are from charcoal, there might be a bit of an old wood effect here, so it's possible that this hiatus could be shifted a little bit further upwards, so really into the 2nd century CE. It's only towards the end of the 2nd century and then continuing during the 3rd century that we see fundamental changes. Across the entire excavated area, we see a rapid resurrection of settlement activity in form of pit houses, many more pit houses, together with a new ceramic complex. Most clearly, we can grasp this new beginning here in this area, where we encountered a total of 5 really simple pit houses in very short succession. In the filling of the earliest of these 5 pit houses, we discovered this interesting fragment of a terracotta figurine representing a camel carrying 2 large vessels. The camel also carries a rider, which is now mostly missing. You see only the legs. And behind the rider sits an animal, a dog, or a feline. From the same context where this figurine was found, we collected a charcoal sample. A sample, but this is not. This is the only non-charcoal sample. This is a barley seed. So there's no old wood effect here, suggesting a date between the second half of the 2nd and the 1st quarter of the 3rd century CE. Now, what makes this figurine so interesting is that it differs radically from earlier camel depictions found in the Bukhara region or anywhere in Sogdiana, which the earlier ones are shown riderless and adhere to a heraldic aesthetic rooted in the nomadic art of the Sarmatian steppes, often, as you can see here from that belt buckle, often in the form of an animal fight. Our camel rider figurine is obviously very different. It is one of the very earliest depictions of a pack camel anywhere in Sogdiana, and thus, I think, really nicely symbolizes the coming dominance of Sogdians along the Silk Roads. But that's not all. In a slightly younger pit house, in the same sequence, slightly higher floor, but still in a 3rd century context, we discovered what seems to be the oldest Sogdian inscription ever found in Bukhara, although it is unfortunately, and thanks to Pasha for advising us on this, unfortunately not really readable. But at any regard, both these finds, the inscribed vessel and the terracotta figurine, point to a period of fundamental cultural and probably also demographic change during beginning in the late 2nd and the early 3rd century, and then continuing throughout the 3rd and into the 4th century CE, which ultimately led to Bukhara evolving into a real city and becoming an important trading center. But not only the city itself changed, also the rural countryside seems to have changed dramatically during this period. How do we know that? We carefully flotated very, very many soil samples, and we can now confidently say that the introduction of cotton in the region dates back to the 3rd or 4th centuries of our era. Something actually also alluded to in the Tarikh-i Bukhara. This was a very important innovation for the region, which must have profoundly transformed the countryside. As you know, it necessitated major investments in hydraulic systems, not only in order to guarantee extra water resources to grow cotton, but also to process cotton. And cotton picking is labor intensive, so it must have had an impact on the very social and economic foundations of the rural and the urban society alike. All this contributed to the formation of Bukhara as a true city. And I shall mention that the introduction of cotton seems to have been part of a larger cultural package of innovations reaching the region from the south during this period. For example, it seems that roughly at the same period also rice farming was introduced to Sogdiana. And in fact, we found one piece of figurative art that seems to reflect these southern connections during the 3rd and 4th centuries, namely this exceptional terracotta figurine, which was, I think, originally applied on some wooden core. It's very unusual. It clearly breathes some southern air reminiscent of late Gandharan art. Interestingly, it was found in association with yet another monumental wall feature that we discovered in our trenches to the west of the former fortress. This monumental wall seems to date also to around the 3rd century CE, but I have to admit more work is necessary to really understand what this feature is all about. All we can say at the moment is that it was not connected to the original fortress, but that it also runs north of this antique watercourse, which still must have existed and functioned during this time. This changes completely at some point in around the early 5th century, we think. At that point, we see evidence for a massive infrastructure project resulting first in the drainage of this old canal running south of the former fortress. We also see the establishment of a regular street grid. So this watercourse was turned into a street now. And we see the construction of the first real city wall in form of a 6.5 meter wide wall with an intramural corridor. We were able to trace this wall over a length of 24 meters, but there is no evidence for towers, at least not in this section. This is a bit, admittedly, unusual for the military architecture in Sogdiana of this period, but it finds a parallel in the fortifications of the Plощadka Piret Citadeliu in Paikent. Now, a terminus post quem for this wall is provided by constructions and installations, perhaps some sort of courtyard, immediately below the preparation packages for the wall, which seem to date into the 4th century. We uncovered a feature which might represent the corner tower of a small suburban kushk, perhaps similar in layout to contemporary castles in the Sogdian countryside. Contemporary to the castle existed a house with a reception hall with 4 columns. So we're talking here about the 5th and the 6th centuries. During the 7th and the 8th centuries, this area just outside the walls of the Shahristan was occupied by very modest dwellings belonging to rather poor households, and this area was, and that goes together, also used for production purposes. So we encountered several kilns as well as a small metal workshop immediately adjoining the Shahristan wall. So let me finally say a few words about our contexts dating to the Samanid and Karaghanid periods, when Bukhara was, especially during the heyday of the Samanids, an important political and cultural center. This centrality is well attested in our finds, most of which come from close to 100 waste and sanitary pits. Many of them contained massive amounts of fine clay ceramics, notably many fragments of the famous Samanid epigraph ware, and I don't want to go into detail here. Kate will talk about these materials tomorrow. But I would like to mention that we also do have evidence for imported pottery, like monochrome lusterware from Iraq and southwestern Iran, as well as fragments of Song period porcelain and Song period celadon ware, which still might have been imported from the Persian Gulf. Some batrabs and tashnaus also contained very rich glassware assemblages, which now, so this glassware corpus from Bukhara, 10th, early 11th century, now equals Nishapur, both in terms of quantity and quality. And here too, we do have clearly imports like this magnificent Millefiori bowl, found in one of the late Samanid, early Karaghanid batrabs. This corpus will be presented more systematically by Nadine Schiebele in the Paris conference in July. And I'd like to mention that the same pits also yielded a very interesting archaeobotanical material in forms of seeds that has been published, very diverse corpus, including exotic spices such as black pepper and sumac. We conducted also excavations at the late Karaghanid cemetery in the northern part of our excavation area, where in an area of, and this became later the stratigraphic trench, and in an area of 6 to 6 down to 6 meters, we excavated and analyzed more than 100 burials. This material is studied forensically by one of our ISO doctoral students for a doctoral thesis, and this study will introduce fresh data on the health status of this 12th, 13th century city population. For example, just quickly, There are a lot of interesting traces for occupational wear. There's plenty of evidence for malnutrition and disease, as far as they have caused skeletal stress markers. So there's widespread evidence for dysentery, no water, black. The water was famously dirty in Bukhara. There was a stunning 15% of observable population that shows evidence for tuberculosis, which was not only an affliction of the lower classes, because even one of the Samanid amirs apparently died of tuberculosis. And I'd like to finish, it's the last minute, with one very exciting and very, very recent discovery. We noticed this really, literally only last month. So it's the first time I'm actually presenting this, because it was only last month that I finally received our data from a ground-penetrating radar survey conducted in the past field season in June by our colleague Zach Sylvia at Brown University at various parts of the inner city. I want to draw your attention here to this area first, between the Masjid Kalon and the Miri Arab. And what you can see here is a clear circular feature of about 18-meter diameter, and that clearly are the traces of Arslan Khan's ill-fated attempt to transfer an older minaret to the new eastern facade of the Congregational Mosque. But that's actually not the exciting find. There is yet another circular feature of similar size inside our excavation trenches. And there can be hardly any doubt, I think, that these are the foundations of Chaikhani's famous minaret constructed in 918, 919, because its location fits exactly with the location ascribed in the Tarikh-i Bukhara as between the citadel and the Shahristan. And this means that parts of the Barmakid Samanid Congregational Mosque are directly accessible in the excavation area. And clearly, their systematic investigation and documentation would be a major step towards a better understanding of the architectural manifestation of the coming of Islam to Bukhara. And curiously, a substantial package of two north-south running walls, they run in the same direction, they're oriented in the same direction as the present-day Congregational Mosque, were discovered last year, and they might represent some walls lining an outer courtyard of the mosque. But however that may be, we will learn more about this when we begin our season in 2025 in 3 weeks from today. And I would like to take the chance finally to thank again all of our collaborators, which involved, of course, many more people than just the three authors of this presentation. Some of them are here, others will hopefully be present in Paris, and I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Søren, for this splendid presentation and so many novelties and so clearly presented and extremely strongly argued at each step. Just as I've make one remark, you know, of course, the name for Bukhara. Wait, it has been disputed, but with Nicholas Sims-Williamson, I think it's actually the name of Bukhara in the Kultobe inscriptions, which date from we tend to date from the 2nd or early 3rd century, but Sasha will probably discuss that more, mention Bukhara under the name Nawak Methan. And Nawak Methan means the new city. And it's actually in the developed form, Nawak Methan Shkanth. It's the origin of Numidshkat, the medieval name, one of the names of Bukhara recorded in the Tarikh of Bukhara. So, 2nd century, perhaps second half of the 2nd century, early 3rd century, it corresponds archaeologically to a period where you notice, after the abandonment of the Hellenistic fortification, a revival of urban life, which eventually led to the construction of one city, one wall, you see 3rd century, and eventually a more substantial one in the 5th. So there is really, it seems in this case, we have really a convergence between the the written source, the epigraphic source, and the archaeological results.
So what we archaeologically have that is, let's say, securely dating to this particular horizon are these pit houses. They are not particularly indicative of urban life yet. That is one thing. The big, I think, the big piece of the puzzle in this for this question is this monumental wall that might also date to the 3rd century, definitely before the 5th century, before the city wall was built, which is still aligned with this old canal. That is a very monumental feature. That yeah.
Fits very well in our broad chronology
Yeah.
of the Kutobe inscription,
Yeah.
which could date at least until the early 3rd century.
Yeah. It's clearly a new ceramic complex that we see coming. I don't want to talk about this too much. This is the work of Azan Targoyev, who will deal with this in Paris in detail. I shall only say that it is actually quite interesting. It's quite different from Kizilkir. We have very, very few parallels with ceramics known from the northwestern and the northeastern parts of the oasis that is labeled usually as Kizilkir ceramics. It's, the ceramics are of a higher quality. It's a lot more wheel-made pottery and also very standardized, actually. It's quite interesting. So that goes into this direction of a process, a very long process of urbanization, I think, or specialization, we should say, at this point.
If I could just continue that thread of thought for a second. From the very earliest core of chronology through to the final stages, and obviously even up to the modern day, the city of Bukhara clearly goes through some kinds of ebbs and flows. But I feel like some of the comments that you're making, even in this context, relate to a vision of what is an urban or what is a city at some stage or another.
Yeah.
And because there's a lot of different ways in which one can conceptualize that, I was hoping you could kind of just be clear about, why, for example, during the stage of pit houses, would you imagine that the city is no longer a city? So anyway, that's a specific thing, but I would just want to see what is your framing for that particular definition? Because it will become something that I think hits throughout the
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent question. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to do that. I would argue that, I use the term mostly to indicate there is really a heightened degree of specialization in the community. So you see specialists in the field of architecture, you see a lot of specialists dealing with the production of particular groups of material. This is what I think makes a city, or one of the things that makes a city as far as we see that archaeologically. Yeah? And this is something where we see stark differences between, let's say, the centuries around the turn of our era, even during the period of the existence of the fortress, and let's say the 5th and 6th century. Now, things are a little bit more complicated, of course, because for the centuries around the turn of our era, we have a very high quality ceramic complex, of course, but people lived in very, very basic pit houses. They were also not very clean, I have to say. Dirt is all over. But then in later periods we see mud brick architecture for domestic dwelling, something that we still don't see in the 3rd century, in the early 3rd century, for example. Yeah.
Just a quick technical question about the carbonized remains that you found in the waterlogged materials. I'm curious, in the cores that you extracted, the abundance of carbonized materials you found in your cores. I think I saw that you maybe took 1 or 2 samples.
No, we took 3 samples from that core,
okay.
yes.
And they lined up?
We have more, but we haven't processed more.
Yeah, I was just curious about how abundant.
It was very abundant.
Very
I could
abundant,
easily process dozens if I had the money to do that.
Okay, yeah. Because I have I've yet to see people use that strategy for working with cultural layers that are beneath it, that are waterlogged.
Yes, so. Thank you for mentioning this. There's a bit of a problem here that I have not addressed, because in waterlogged contexts, material can move a little bit up and down. And it is actually not from the very earliest horizons of the coring that we have the early state. So they come a little like this, but there are clearly samples from under the water that date to this period, but they are not as nicely stratified as we would expect them.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe more sampling can help, although I think there's just this movement in the water, yes.
Right. And it may call for just more sampling
Yeah.
to test your results. Thank you.
Okay, well then, thank you very much, Professor Stark. So we'll move on to the second presentation for this morning, which will be Professor Alexander Neymark of Hofstra University, presenting the historical geography of Sogd according to numismatic data mid-3rd century BCE to mid-8th century CE. So please help me to welcome Professor Neymark.
First of all, I would like to say that Soren gave quite a tour de force. It was great material, and to my relief, I saw that it actually corresponds very well to what I want to say. Well, I don't know if I correctly remembered the name of the talk, but so nobody needs to introduce Sogdiana. I guess I can pass quickly 4 oases. That is Samarkand, Bukhara, Kesh, and Nakhsheb, on 2 rivers, Zarafshan and Kashkadarya. And the journey of Sogdian numismatics starts actually in Hellenistic period, Seleucid coins minted in Samarkand, and then we have a question of when Greek control collapsed in Sogdiana. I just published an article. I would like just to demonstrate the plates for it, which shows early Euthydemus imitations from Bukhara, and I hope settles the question, giving the date between 230 and 225 BC for the departure of Greeks. Well, after that, we see various kinds of what in the past was called barbaric imitations. Nowadays, it's just imitational coinages. This was the field developed by my teacher, Eugen Zemel, of the Hermitage Museum. He did a wonderful work, and his work came out of very simple consideration: 4 oases, 4 zones of minting. And that is the original, first, actually, systematic scheme of the development of Sogdian coinage, early Sogdian coinage, before the 5th century, well, including 5th century. That has been produced by scholarly world. That was done in, I'm afraid it's 81 or 82, I don't remember exactly. It became a bit more complicated since then, but principally it holds up. So that is what I would offer instead of it, with all the respect to Zemel's work, which lays in the foundation of what I've done here. Well, as you can see, there are 4 areas of minting, and although in some of those you have multiple coinages, well, we'll start with Samarkand, that is Antiochus imitations, and here is an important footnote. Once Greeks departed, we would expect imitation of coinages and nomads taking over. Didn't happen, because this is 3-denominational coinage. As you can see, it runs as drachms, hemidrachms, and abos. That's coinage well suited for good exchange on the market. So there was still city life, and there was still economy after Greeks departed. Well, that didn't last that long, because around the middle of the 2nd century, well, it defined by use of a new prototype for obverse, which obviously comes out of coins of Euthydemus or Eucratides. Well, question in this case, probably the 2nd, if we accept one of the interpretations, although it preserves still, but misinterprets the Antiochus imitation reverse. And that is the second stage. Well, it runs for a while, coins become really bad, everything is gloomy, and then we see strange story around the middle of the 1st century BC, mints start multiplying. First 2 mints producing Antiochus imitations in the Zarafshan Valley, then in fact one of them divides into 2 more, and we have 3 mints. Well, let's follow them. First mint once more picks up the same Eucratides as a prototype for obverse. That must be quite later, but still paying tribute to the tradition. But the reverse actually corresponds to the late imitation of the second stage, so it's out of question that it's parallel line. And then it runs for a while, becoming really ugly by the end, with this very strange hoard at the neck of the horse, and ultimately turns into independent Sogdian coinage, which was actually running for quite a lot of time after that. Well, we're talking about probably 150 or more years. Transforming. There are inscriptions, none can be read so far, because we all the time, there are at least 2 versions, none of them can be read so far because they actually imitations, what we have already distorted inscription. So I'm still waiting, sitting and waiting until one appears from the ground so that I would jump on it. Didn't happen yet. Sometimes happens, but not in this case. Another line. Now, this line, and interestingly, is actually connected to the area of Ishtihan. Well, the easternmost coin of this type is found in Durmen. And then we have them in Ishtihan, we have them in Koshrabat, and so that's pretty much this area to the west of Samarkand. It's Miankal, Koshrabat, and the area which local collectors now call Polygon to the south. So we have about a dozen registered coins from there, and at least a dozen coins with blurry origin just from the area of Polygon. Dozen we have with a precise position. Next one. I'm sorry. This is strange series, very, very long. I'm showing you very short synopsis. The sheets which I have actually, are very large, very long, and very boring. Spend a lot of time doing them. Finally, result is that I think that this is a coinage of Samarkand. And it goes into the middle, probably, or let's say at least second quarter of the 3rd century Anno Domini. Never had obverse, just the reverse. Horse head, which turns into dots. And the third line, which was in this division chart, was connected to the area. Well, it's Hercules, turns into Hercules coinage, and that comes from a broad area from this western part of Zarafshan Valley, that is area of Nava Karmina. There are only 2 finds so far there, but mostly from the Bukharan oasis. Nevertheless, being insolent by nature, I suggest that they are coming from Karmina rather than anything else, because in the Bukharan oasis, they're incompatible with local coinage of Euthydemus. There are no crossings with the Euthydemus imitation coinage, no titles, no script, no images, nothing crosses with clearly Bukharan coinage. So should be another center. The only center that I can see is Harkana or Lesser An. Makes sense in terms of interpretation. I cannot prove it, but I am sure in it. That sounds well, right? So how it is happening, when they really become bad, we have mules. Here are 10 mules. There's an article I published in Winners Journal some time ago about those, but actually we have now more. We have a dozen of them, which are very strange coins. They retained the completely distorted imitation reverse, and then they added very decent portrait, which actually keeps evolving on these coins, of Hercodes, the very first portrait of a nomadic ruler in our whole area. It's earlier than Heraeus. Well, the portrait is quite remarkable. The small denomination, actually, that is development or transition from this muse to the small denomination, and then below is big denomination, which actually has the image of Srosh, well, similar to something that was found by Australian mission and published by Franz Grenet and Minardi in Horizm. The history of Hercodes coinage is very long. It goes till the middle of the 3rd century. It has two denominations. The large one, drum, which eventually becomes a coin of 0.6 centimeter. 6 millimeters, right? 6 millimeters, and weighs 0.6 gram, almost invisible. We are lucky that some of them are found even in micro hoards, like in Kumsaftan with 4 coins, so then you don't miss them. Well, what is interesting is that small denomination actually changes. We have different inscriptions, different portraits on them. Large denomination does not change. It's kind of counterintuitive. In normal numismatics, large denominations is always more, attracts more attention from the mint, and small denomination is little crap that actually no pays attention to. In reality, here is different because small denomination reflects local aspirations. Large denomination should be stable for international trade. Sogdians already started their tricks at that time. Well, competitive coinage in Bukhara are Euthydemus imitations, and these are the first coins with Sogdian inscription. There are altogether 8 known of them. Here are 4. We can't read it, it's still missing a letter, something like Rust. But it has title, Mrai, and then we have coins with nomadic tamga from 5 to 18. Tamga is exactly Sarmatian, and that corresponds quite well to the period which Seren just showed to be a period of troubles and destruction in Bukhara. That must be the end of the 1st century, our era. Well, we didn't finish actually with Antiochus imitations. We have to go back for a second to Samarkand series, which was known a little bit in the past. I personally misplaced it at a certain point, thinking that it was South Sogd. By now, I am sure that it is actually Samarkand Sogd. 13 coins with precise origin, about 20 with actually generic origin from certain area. All of it is actually to the east of Samarkand. We're talking about the area of Bulungur, that is Barkat, Kabudan, Sangzar Valley, and then up Sangzar Valley to Jizak Oasis, the westernmost single find in Kosharbat. So, looks like this coinage is limited to the 1st century Anno Domini, starting around the 1st decades and goes into the end of the 1st century Anno Domini. Interrupts in the early 2nd, or at the end of the 1st. Altogether, that looks like this. So I don't think there's any point to discuss the situation with the existence of Sogdian culture at the time. 9 myths working simultaneously in Sogdian in the 1st century Anno Domini. Some of them producing up to 3 denominations. that is Ashtad in southern Sogd. Two denominations, Sega Haris in Kesh. Well, that is Nakhshab, that is Kesh. And Hercules, two denominations. Market coinage, well developed. In fact, we can go to southern Sogd, but before we have to stop once more in Samarkand. That's a recent thing. To the west of Samarkand, 50 kilometers, area of Sarakul-Tepe, between Sazagan and Sarakul-Tepe, is this coinage. Imitations of Eucratides starts around 40s Anno Domini, and due to this absolutely recent find a few weeks ago, which actually owes stripe of this late stage on the coin of Hercules and Zeus, this can be dated to the end of the 2nd century Anno Domini. Well, if we go to the south, we go into area with two large principalities, Kesh and Nakhshab, and then something that is Valley of Guzar River, which sometimes in the early Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, was an independent political unit. So what do we have there? That is Sega Haris. That's not the name, that's title. Well, blessed ruler, something like this. And that is Kesh coinage of the 1st to the end of the 2nd century. And that is Ashtad, two denominations, coins in Nakhshab. We go further, it turns into sword-bearer coins of Nakhshab. And I think we should mention something little, this one. Only 5 coins known so far. It is an imitation of Eucratides aboves. Well, imitation of Eucratides aboves. That's our business, right? But already with Greek inscription. Unfortunately, even the last specimen, which is better, didn't give the full inscription. It starts with ypsilon, it ends with moi, so it's genitive, but in the middle, too much lost. In fact, I can think of 3 more letters, but I can still not create something that would be persuasive. So I'm still waiting. Well, that is the ancient period. What is happening? We have significant proliferation of means in the 1st century, which actually ends by the end of the 1st century, and then with this first half of the 2nd century, it actually reduces. It doesn't go completely away. We have stabilization of coinage in 5 centers, sorry. But out of 9, by the end of the 2nd century, we have 5 with stable, massive coinage, and then all of it ends up with Kushano-Sasanian conquest. All these coinages are cut off in the 2nd quarter of the 3rd century Anno Domini. In Bukhara, it's replaced with Kushano-Sasanian monetary circulation, which goes for 100 years. In Samarkand, it's the start of archer coinage around the middle of the 3rd century. I'm not going to terrorize you with 14 series of archer coins. You will die here, and that's not my purpose today. And then, actually, in Kesh, it's king slaying the lion, Leontomachia coins, which actually start first as imitation of copper imitation of archer coins, then into this one. Well, and then we go into the medieval period. This sedation with 3 coinages lasts for about 200 years. In the 2nd half of the 6th century, sedation changes once more. And the process of proliferation of means started once more. That is the time of Sogdian numismatics, which was dominated by Olga Smirnova. So this is Olga Ivanovna Smirnova, who did the main work. And she identified principally 3 coinages. Samarkand, that is late 6th, early 7th century coinage of Samarkand. That is later stuff, Ugrak, and then Turgar. So that was one center. The 2nd center she dealt with was Penjikent, and she identified coinage of Penjikent, 3 rulers. Unfortunately, there is one fake nowadays, that is so-called Bilge, Bichut, sorry, coin, that is fake. But otherwise, it's the same, 3 rulers, everything is okay. And of course, she identified Ustrushana. All of them were slightly improved by later scholarship, the sequences, the details, and so on. We still keep doing this periodically. Ustrushana particularly had to be redone most recently in terms of sequence. So that's how it looks like now. But that's not the end of the story. Because during the last 2.5 years, we actually, largely with Anwar Hadjaev, managed to sometimes did things by myself, sometimes with him, sometimes he does. So we actually identified a number of other centers of minting, and that reflected here. So this is actually Zamin, late 6th, 7th, early 8th century. Next one to the west, well, southwest, is a little city of Nuchkat, but had its own coinage in the early 7th and early 8th century. Then we are not sure yet, 3 specimens known. One is in early collection, 2 from the area. Coinage of Harkana, not Western Harkana, the one which is at the entrance to the Bukhara villages, but the one which is sitting in the Tamerlan gates, right next to it. I'm not sure, but the 2 coin finds from the area, and they're not known anywhere else, maybe. And then the coinage of Fiknan, which is actually modern Jizak, apparently was rather significant principality, and massive coinage, which looks like, I guess this, right, yeah. Goes into Islamic period. Mid 8th century. As if it's not enough, 2 sites which we knew before can be now supplied with their own coinage. That's Barkat and 2 types of coins, and then proved by Horde and at least 100 specimens from one side, and then Kabudan, formerly known as Samitan. We spent some time with Pasha arguing what's written there. I guess we agreed that it's written, what was it, Nafabat, right? But then there's something right here, but then something which is comprehensible, Semidahin. So, not quite clear. I don't know, what did you do in the book?
It was not me.
Well, oh. Take off responsibility of himself. It was not enough. We can talk about coinage of Ishtikhan, because that certainly was not minted in Samarkand, not on the main mint. That is a separate line. That's coins with the name of Turhar. They look Bukhar Khuda, but they have different name. They are rare. Dozen specimens are known. And then later, something that was Malka, Samarkand Tanga, so should be Ikhshid, but didn't find any place in the sequence. Smirnov was confused. And initially, I read it Izid, Yazid, corresponding to De Goe's rendition of the name of Bukhar Khuda in Tarikh al-Tabari. But that is consummation, because dot, no dot in Arabic text. And then it turned out that it actually Ro there, you can more or less clearly see. So the guy's name is Ayrid. I don't want to say that he was Herod, but something like this. And then this mysterious coin, which actually still doesn't let me sleep properly. We published it together with Luke Treadwell. The inscription on the Arabic side, with mistakes, cites Ishtikhan as a place of mintage, but Ishtikhan written with one wrong letter. The date, however, is clear. So 160. And the problem is here seems to be Hubu, and then the name coming out of it. Yeah. Well, but name is not readable. Single specimen, we need more. Please, if you see anything. So, and then, of course, in the area where we once had this Eucratidis imitations in the western part, that's Abgar, little Rustak, in the 7th, 8th centuries. Well, Bukhara Oasis is easy. First identifications were made by Shishkin. That's, by the way, his own. He was a brilliant draftsman. I think it's a great portrait of him himself in 1911, when he was still a teacher of drawing. And then, well, we have this long Asbar and Asbar imitations. And then we have 14 series of portraits and three-quarter, which I'm not going to show. Too boring, very interesting for me though. And then these are camel coins of Bukhara. That is the first third of the 7th century. Then something that I would call Chinese type Bukharan coins, 3 types going into the early 8th century. And then this is when Bukhar Hudaz moved the mint to Varaksha. That's why there is a change of Tamha, because in this case, mint is represented by Tamha. And last ones are perfectly Islamic, with Muhammad Rasulullah and things like this, and the denomination of value. Only one mint otherwise surely known in Bukhara, I attribute it to Vardana. Vardana people who are excavating there stubbornly not finding it there. I don't know what to say about it. It's embarrassing. But it's a separate mint for sure, dated to particular time, so I can do everything that I can do in numismatic work. I'm depending here on the finds. Well, this I cannot place anywhere. That's a huge hoard of over 4,000 coins in Pikend. I have my idea what is it. I'm not going to share it at this point because it would be too long, but just interesting. And the last part, Kashkadaria. First coins were attributed by Kabanov. Sergei Kuzmich, he found them during the excavations in large numbers. These are these coins, remarkable in many respects. Now we can say that they were minted from the middle of the 4th to the middle of the 6th century, uninterrupted. Then Boris Kochnev actually attributed these coins to Nakhshab. That is 7th century coinage, late 7th, 8th century coinage of Nakhshab. Right now, we have better idea of what is chronology and typology and everything else, and we also read inscriptions. It turned out to be Sardar Khuda, and particularly one type is actually minted by Alishkand, the famous enemy of Arabs, Aispahbad of Nasaf. And then this is attribution by 2 great scholars, Lifshitz and Archeladze, of these coins. They attributed to cash coins of Akhorpat. Well, by now we have more types, 3 times more types, but it's confirmed the attribution. Everything is great. And then holes were furnished. This is something that I did a long time ago about the coins in between Archer coinage and Leontemachia coinage. Then that is what more recently, well, this is the transition. That is what more recently done for transition between Leontemachia coinage and the 7th century coinage of Nakhshab. That is 7th century coinage of Nakhshab. Although it has Samarkand Tamga, it is Nakhshab coinage. And then ultimately we have this scheme of coinage for South Sogd, which is complete. Well, I guess I gave you more or less a survey of recent developments in Sogdian numismatics. Thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to answer anything you want to ask.
Okay, so there's some time for questions. Yes, in the back, and then.
You identified the Ishitan and the Naksha as copper and silver. What about the metals of all the other coins?
Let's put it this way. Before the first half of the 3rd century, anything is silver, with the exception of 3 small attempts to mint copper. So all early coins are silver. In the second part of the story, with the exception of Bukhar Khuda and Samarkand Archer, well, in some minor things, once and more, well, I haven't shown them, it's all copper. The division is Kushano-Sasanian invasion. These Kushano-Sasanians had bad effect on us. We became cheap.
Second part of the question is, are these coins housed in any of the museums in Uzbekistan, or did the Russians take them all to St. Petersburg?
Well, I had a conversation with the State Department recently about it, saying that during the last years, probably something in an order, well, in the last 5 years, something in an order of 80,000 coins have been exported from Uzbekistan to the United States alone. So don't blame all Russians. I don't like them principally, but it's not just Russians. Europe, Japan buys, the most expensive collectors are in Japan. Shinji Hirano pays big money, right? I know many of them by name. I know who is selling them. The only thing we can do about it, unfortunately, because we have to watch how the sites are being stripped of coinage in thousands. You won't believe me if I tell you that there are bastards in the Bukharan oasis, right next to Soren Stark, right? And he was even threatened with the rifles by them, right? Or your people, not you personally, right? I saw the photo. I'm not acquainted with them, though, because they are hostile, and I stay away from guns. I've been shot at earlier. So imagine pile of copper coins, mostly Islamic, in the size of this table, like this. That's unused crap that they cannot sell. They sell it by weight. Well, museums do not have numismatists in Uzbekistan. Museums do not have funds. So, for example, a lot of stuff I was showing together with Ata Hajayev, we just buy on our own money and give it to Bukhara, to Samarkand Museum. But unfortunately, I am not a millionaire, so I can do sometimes certain things which I think are very important, and that's about it. Sometimes Samarkand Museum has funds. Bukharan Museum does not buy really practically anything. They bought a collection, one large collection recently, but they paid for enormous collection of metal, something in the order of 50 million sum, which was about $5,000. That's all they had. So if you know anybody, and I'm absolutely serious about it, to set up a foundation which would buy in Uzbekistan from these coin robbers coins for local museums, I would be into helping to organize it. And that's not much money. We're still talking about very limited amounts of money. That could save a lot of stuff. But otherwise, the only thing I can do, I can talk to them, I can have from them information once in a while. Sometimes they're stubborn, sometimes they're very unpleasant, sometimes they're cooperating. Sometimes you eat pilav together, which actually badly affects my stomach.
Sasha, well, I have a few questions. No, sorry. But first, have you addressed the foundation for the culture and heritage of Uzbekistan?
Well, you mean Firdavs, or the daughter?
I mean the daughter.
The daughter's husband collects coins. He bought coins from the hoard, part of the coins from the hoard from Bashtepe, and I cannot get access to them, right? No, not Firdavs, the husband of the president's daughter.
Have you addressed Gayena Umerova? She's the one in charge.
Yeah. Well, I'm a small man. You want to take part in it, to conduct talks, I will be in.
Should be mentioned. They're supposed to.
Because they're all the time in Paris.
Well,
you were.
They have money, for sure. Right. I have just two minor points. You mentioned Well, Yazid mentioned by Tabari as the one who gave advice for the reconstruction of the Kampir Diwal.
Yeah,
I
that's
think, maybe I'm wrong, I think he's not the Bukhar Khuda, I think he's the Irshid.
No, he's Irshid of Samarkand.
He's Irshid of Samarkand, yeah.
And his coins, I thought that he's Yazid.
I think
But
it's
if
tempting.
he could be Yarid in Arabic text, right? But on my coin, it's actually written I Rit. Well, Aleph, Yod, Roa, T, period. So, what can I do?
Another remark is about the coin, the coin for the Bukhara Oasis, early 1st century AD. Which shows a fire deity, and you identified it as Srosh. It's not exactly that. The inscription is actually a quite faithful rendering of the Avestan formula, fire of Asha. It's in Avestan it's Artahiach, and I don't remember how is it in Greek, but
Ordothoi.
Yes.
Ordothoi, right.
Ordothoi. It's actually the fire, the god fire, and he is he appears in the images from Ankara as actually closely associated with Srosh, according to the way we interpret the paintings, but it is not Srosh. He's a kind of the fire in the Avesta is a partner of Srosh, because he's the one who
protects the fire.
Well, Srosh actually is the master of the ritual activity, and there is an association between Srosh, the rooster, who wakes up the faithful in the morning when it's needed to feed the fire, and the fire. So it's not exactly, it's the company of Srosh. It's not exactly Srosh.
Well, obviously, I am not a Zoroastrian, and I cede the ground to you
Mary
completely.
Bowles probably was.
But the problem is with inscription, because neither Nick Sims-Williams nor Pasha were able to figure out what is Orda, because it's actually yeah. So that is a bit of a problem with the first part of title. Well, I would love to say that it's like a wardrobe, the guardian of fire, but guardaroba is not working. I mean, no Italian here.
I just had a clarifying question about the Leontomachia coinage. Is that where the Leontomachia where is that coming from? And is it limited to the southern oases? You have it here with Kesh and Nachshab.
Well, I have an article in production right now with topography. The 4 hordes, actually 5 hordes, one we don't know where from, appeared as a horde on the market. Well, for some time. But 4 hordes we know, 2 in Nachshab, 2 in Kesh. And about 30 coins in Kesh upper area, about a dozen coins in lower part of Kesh area, and about 150 in Nachshab. 4 in Huzar. So whatever you want to do out of it, it covers the entire South Sogd. What is interesting, we usually cannot say what is the realm really. In this coins, it's quite clearly written. It says Kashianak, and then there's a word about which we argue all the time. Last time we had this argument with Pasha on internet, right? Yeah, on emails, and even on the phone, and we still didn't come to completely sensible solution. But that's a title. What title we still arguing? But Henning thought it was Kavi. Lifshitz, thought it was Hwab. Well, all kinds of things. It's neither reads really. We probably will eventually figure it out. But this is obviously coinage which is circulating in the entire territory, both Kesh and Nachshab, and even Huzar. And it says that it's issued by the king of Kesh, which means that Southern Sogd, for this period of 200 years, was probably one unit, covered by one coinage. Like Samarkand was probably more or less one unit, covered by Archer coinage, and Bukhara was pretty much covered by Asbar coinage. Does it mean that there were no other independent realms? I can't say because, well, that's the limitation of the material. I can say only what is there.
Thank you, Sasha. Really very, very rich, and there's a lot to think about political and economic history. Just a very, very little kind of speculation, actually, with regard to your Wada coins you're embarrassed about, and I'm sure you thought about that. Wouldn't it be natural to assume or to think that this coinage could possibly come from Arkud, Tawawiz, Kishtuwan, because it is one of the economic centers of the oasis?
Yeah, well, traditionally, Karmina is huge, rich area of its own, with a large nomadic area of Kenimech added to it up to Nurata. So it's a economic hub. In the 18th century,
no, I mean Tawawiz.
But Tawawiz is within this area. But the problem is that with Arkud, Arkud is used as a name of a place near Harkana, and also as an old name of Tawawiz. In sources, there's a confusion about it. Pasha is the one who actually suggests, not me. Pasha suggested that Arkud and Hirkud are somehow connected in an article which he never published.
But you published that.
But I published Pasha's
I know it.
with faithful reference. With faithful reference. Anyway, but well, he was promising for 20 years, right? So
it's just we know there was a big market there. It's still Kishtuwan. It's kind of the economic thing. I would expect the coinage there.
I have an alternative attribution into Tawawiz as Arkud, and I have to the one which I suggested for Harkana in the article on the coinage of Nakhsha Ashtad. But well, let's see. Well, one thing which is disturbing: this area does not produce ancient coins. Really, none. You were close there. You know the situation. None. And that's an interesting problem. We should send somebody there and clean the Harkana citadel cut to see, maybe even to go from top of the cut down with a metal detector on ropes. That's kind of nice alpinist work, right? I'm fat and old. I cannot do it.
Okay, thank you very much, Sasha. So, well, it's not a secret that I heard much about that material previously, also in some lectures of Sasha and also on many Zoom calls and so on, discussing these azores, but it was very useful to see it all together put in one coherent picture, which I admire very much. So just a couple of suggestions or questions. Can we go to the slide with small Hirkod coins?
No, Gazan. No way.
No. Much earlier. You did, yes. Oh.
This is so.
The next slide, I think.
The next? No, next previous is here.
No, yes, this one.
Yeah.
In the center. I see the name written quite well as Artaban.
Well, I was entertaining this thought. First two letters are not clearly visible. So,
well, in the central one, who resembles some similarity to you, by the way.
The central upper one, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, well.
Just behind his head, I think it's Artaban. Artaban.
Yeah.
So he doesn't need to be altogether Parthian. So we have this name in Sogdian ancient letters, 100 years after Arsacids.
I would say that this is above, last to the next to the last, right?
No, I think it can be P easily. Artaban. And okay, and just one more thing is about the coins which you continue to entertain yourself about Ishtihan. So this Sitina Wamia, which is placed in the center, which you usually which you read as the date.
Sitina Wamia, right? Yeah.
Could it be the indication of denomination? So 160 coins in 1 dirham.
There
like
is
we
no,
have Asharina Wamia on.
there's no date in the issue data around.
Yes.
And there's another story. All the coins we have with denominational values are always divisible on 6. This one would not be divisible by 6 because it's 160. Right?
160, yeah.
Yeah, it's not divisible by 6, so that's why I actually departed. Originally, I thought that it was also the denomination value. But 240. 240 там the year. So it's either 240 or 120 or 60 or 30, always. So.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I have a question about the circulation of this coin, especially in the 7th century. I was wondering if there was a local circulation or if you know anything about them in China specifically, since in China we have all these Byzantine, Sasanian, pseudo-Sasanian coins. I was wondering why we do not have anything considering the trading of the Sogni, especially those with the camels.
Well,
so how were used?
Very simple answer, it's copper. Copper is local. So sometimes it travels. Sometimes you have Samarkand coins in Bukhara. You rarely have Bukharan coins in Samarkand, almost never. South Sogd accepts coins from Samarkand and Bukhara alike. Areas to the north actually accept Samarkand and South Sogd, but not Bukhara. Beyond Sogd, we have rare finds of Samarkand coins in Chach. We have finds of Bukhara coins in Lower Sirdarya, but no further. And our silver was minted poorly intentionally. It's actually to prevent export of silver from Central Asia. We know it from the whole chapter tale in Tarikh-i Bukhara, which says that they were losing silver in local circulation, so they intentionally minted it in low quality, assigning a conventional value to it so that it wouldn't travel out of the country. We also know that on the Amudarya border, custom officers were extracting silver bullion from the travelers in early Islamic times. That was a problem. So that's probably why we don't find that many in China. Surprisingly, we have some Peroz imitations in China, which are ours, but they're coming with a flow of Peroz imitations which are coming from Takharistan. And these are bypassing us, going directly to China. How the hell? I don't know.
Please help me welcome Berthier Lyonnais from the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris to present an attempt at a comprehensive chronology of the pottery of the Samarkand area in relation to historical events from the 13th century to the 5th century. It's a longer title in the program than on the slide, but
Yes.
I hope it didn't change too much in the details.
No.
All right, thank you very much.
It's okay.
Thank you very much. I first would like to thank very, very much the organizers for the invitation and the very interesting talks we had, and I'm sure we will have. I'm glad to see that what I'm going to say also fits with Soren and with Sasha's presentation. Pretty much. Of course, we have many details to fix. It's very ambitious, and I hope I'll stick within the time that you have given. Here, just a very general view, because I thought that, you know, if it is for popularizing this area, we have to know what we are speaking about. It's an area which is within the Amudarya River and the Sirdarya area, with to the north and south very different people. In the north, people who are more or less mobile and cattle breeders, and to the south, farmers with more sedentary way of living. Sogdiana itself is bounded by, watered by the Zarafshan River and the Karshi Darya, the Kashka Darya, with different cities, important, Samarkand, Bukhara, and of course Nakhsha. And also we will speak here about Koktepe, another very important city in the early periods. And my main talk concerns, of course, pottery that was found during the excavation made by the French-Uzbek expedition, Mahfouz, mainly on Koktepe and Samarkand, where we have, of course, archaeological excavations we had, and that gave a lot of information, but you have to know that in this area, especially in Samarkand, a lot of the layers are just totally destroyed by pits and pits and pits, because it was occupied constantly and up to the Mongol period. So it is sometimes very difficult to have a real stratigraphy. We had absolutely no coins. A few have been found afterwards, but they are not in situ. And we had no radiocarbon dates from Afrasiab. We have only a few from Koktepe. So we had to deal with a lot of comparisons. So I just want to go back to periods that we have not excavated, but that give an idea of the people who were living in the Zarafshan area, or in Sogdiana in general, at that time. So I'm going back to the Chalcolithic period, down to the end of the Bronze Age, and here we will see that we have only cattle breeders who are at the same time metallurgists, and some evidence of contacts with the south and the north, but no sedentary people really living. So at that time the people were living in what we call zemlyanka, so semi-buried houses, and the pottery is always gray with incisions. Here you have from different sides, and you can see this pottery, which is rather crude, handmade, with a lot of different tempers, but that are specific to these people. They were great metallurgists, as shown by these furnaces and crucibles, a lot of jewelry in metal. But we had contacts with other people from the west in the Jeoksur area in Turkmenistan, and from the south in Balochistan, and from many other areas. And these contacts are also visible in other sites, like Zaman Baba near Bukhara, with this kind of pottery model houses, or in the jewels with these pearls, cruciform pearls. You also have in graves evidence of contacts with the south, with pottery, which is typical from the southern areas, the farmers' areas, while all the rest of the material is typical of the steppes. So at Koktepe, only at Koktepe, we have a few sherds of this period. So all these settlements of people that are more from the northern side went on for at least two millenniums, and then suddenly there is a break with what is called the Yazwan period, but it is more known under the name of Burgulyuk in Sogdiana. So this interlude is marked by the introduction of many different pottery. It's all one group, but you have a lot of local variations. So most of them are here in the north of the Hindu Kush, but you have also the same to the south of the Hindu Kush, and it's the first time that you can see the same kind of material both north and south of the Hindu Kush. And you also have it in China. So here is the material, as you can see yourself with your eyes. It's very different from the one you had before. It is always red-orange pottery, and it is always painted, but with a lot of different variations. This is on the west, it's from Turkmenistan, in the center from Jarkutan, and on the right from Chust, Fergana. And this is from Mundigak. The main difference is the round bottoms of the pots and a lot of bowls, also rounded bottom bowls. The temper is also very different. The technology is different. So all this make me consider that we're dealing with totally different people from the previous ones. What is also very different is that at that time we had absolutely no graves, no burials. The religion suddenly totally changes. Of course, we have some premises before of this change in religion, but at that time it's just totally. So Koktepe, the site I mentioned you before, is one of the main settlements for this new pottery. And all the area that you see, so not only all this area is covered with shirts of this Bogoliuk period, but also I remember that here we collected a lot. So it was really a huge settlement at that time. There was no fortification. The only architecture we have is these semi-buried houses, the same as before. I mean, the one I showed you on the picture was very large. These are smaller, but it's still the same habitat. So here is the pottery from Koktepa. You see the same shapes, always round bottom, red light, with painting on the top. And by the end of the period, we have a slight change with incisions coming in the decoration. Here you can see a kind of zigzag and applied decoration too. And more interesting, these kind of spouts that are not opened here. But you have the same spouts on cooking ware, and these are useful. And on the other part, you have handles. So it is a new ware coming in, and this ware I relate to Saka people that are much more visible a little after. So starting with about the 9th or 8th century, you have a profusion of these cooking ware with handles, knobs or handles on the sides, 2 or 4 depending on how big they are. Sometimes you have a hole in the bottom. Here you have a few examples and different kinds of knobs. And you have also these kind of pottery. I mean, all this is very gross. Handmade, kind of beige or gray-like. On the right, you don't see the color because it's covered with calcium. But the temper has nothing to do with the Andronovo period. So it's a new material, and we can relate it really to Saka. And for instance, you have exactly the same kind of pottery in Uigarak and in Khorezm, in Kuyusai site. We still don't have, at least at Koktepe, we have no kurgans or graves related to these new people who came. But they may have existed in other places around. We just don't have any information about the religion that was practiced then. A little later, a little later, at Koktepe, suddenly you have the introduction of architecture, fortified architecture here and here. It is made of plano-convex bricks, all with marks, round towers, or semi-round towers, and you had a main gate here. This is a very large change because it's the suddenly first fortifications that appear. So maybe the first steps towards urbanization. And you have the same, exactly the same architecture that was found really in a small place on this 27 excavation by Igor Ivanitsky and Mila Shpinyova. And they have found also one round tower and plano-convex bricks mixed more or less with already rectangular bricks. So, and the ceramics also starts to change. So you have shapes like biconical pots, and also these kind of very large jars with a conical base, but still the handles, and very large, pots, pretty much, I guess, pretty much the same shape, all handmade. And the typical fabric at that time is the use of schist. And you can see here some of the inclusions that are huge. Here, this is one. So all this for me, you also have, starts at this period, some tableware. It is still handmade, still with crushed schist, and it gives them this kind of violet pinkish color. And this goes on until very late. I mean, down to the Greek period you have it, and you even have it later in kurgans, and even later in Hisarāk, for instance, you have the same kind of pottery. So this is a very important traditional ware of this area. For me, related to the Saka, but because of this introduction of this fortification, which is totally new and that I don't see who among the Saka could have originated, I think that these innovations are due to the first Achaemenid who came in and conquered Sogdiana, Cyrus II. And to say so, I relate the few sherds we have in Afrasiab down, the two bottoms down, and at Koktepa, the two sherds above, that are related to the shapes you have on the left, which are typical of the end of Yas II beginning of Yas 3 period. And these goblets, which are rather tall, are really a new shape. And for me, it is related to this ware, very famous, coming from Malik. So that's much earlier. It's around the 10th, 9th century BC. But Cyrus is more or less related to the Mards. These are the Mards. And I think it could be an explanation for the introduction of this new goblet. You also find the same kind of belt here, you see, that you have here. And this, and here, and here. So a little later, we have the appearance, the introduction of a new architecture, which apparently didn't stand very long, didn't last very long. These are these round structures with round towers, but they're already all made with rectangular bricks. That's the only difference with the previous ones. So here you have an example from Talashkan on the left in Surkhandaria, and Kurganzol, of course, which is up north at the border with Sogdiana, and which I redated already in an article before. But you should know that 5 such round structures have been found west to Samarkand by Olga Invetkina through the satellite pictures, but they have not been excavated. And one has been excavated by Sharov at the border with Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, Kruglaya Krepost. Very often, at the first level, these are almost empty. There is no structure inside, which is interesting because it could be a kind of military fortress for a short while garrisons. We have them in Bactria, and they go up to Khorasan. You have many of these. And they could date to the period of Darius I, because probably the conquest of Cyrus II was not accepted immediately, you would say. So it is probable that you had some unrest and again a kind of military pacification of the area. So the ceramics, after that, the ceramics change. You have more of Wiltern pottery coming from Bactria, from the south. So this is a pot that France has found on the left, also in the very bottom of the fortification in Samarkand, and you have very famous shape, you know, of these cylindro-conical jars, typical of the Achaemenid period. But if we accept this chronology of Cyrus, Darius, and then this where that starts, this would mean rather late, not before the the early 4th century. And it is very difficult to make a distinction with the period when Alexander conquered Sogdiana again. But I feel that many of the sherds that we have found from Koktepe, which look very much Achaemenid-like, but have these colors, you know, they are not cylindro-conical, they are already always closed at the top. They don't have a conical base, they have a round base. All these are already probably Alexander's period. And we have a lot in Koktepe not as many on Afrasiab itself. Here again, another one. And these are typical shapes, Achaemenids from the Achaemenid period, but it goes down into Alexander's period and then afterwards. You have these tulip bowl wares, a kind of amphora return, and this G-shape ware, well-turned. Here you have a very strange torpedo jar. I call it a torpedo jar. This is the name they give it in the Middle East, and many of them have been found in the Persepolis treasury. So I feel this would fit very well with Alexander's period. But at the same time, you have still these handmade with schist, crushed schist temper, with the shapes imitating the Wilton one, going on handmade, so showing that the population still goes on doing its own pottery. The real change happens a little later during the Seleucid period. And here you have, of course, these fish bowls that start, or these echinus bowls, which are typical Mediterranean shapes introduced by the Seleucid. But the rest goes on. I mean, all the pots I showed you with the round bottoms, these go on. You see here, the bottom is now almost flat, but not really flat. It's always a little, balancing. The only slipped ware that I found are the goblets with a red slip. This pottery with the Mediterranean shapes is not found on all the sites of Sogdiana. For instance, at Koktepe, we have no, I think we have one or two fish plates, no echinus bowls, and on many sites in the Zarafshan Valley, you don't have any of these. It doesn't mean that it is not already the Seleucid occupation. But it means that the Seleucid occupation with Macedonian garrisons or Greco-Macedonian garrisons were only on a very specific sites. And Afrasiab is a typical one, because there obviously you had a huge garrison with Greek soldiers, and also in, I saw that in Yerkogan they also have. So Yerkogan was probably also a big center for that. But on many of the other sites, you don't have that. And the Seleucid occupation is not, for me, it is not a colonization. It is exclusively a military occupation, because you have no evidence. At Afrasiab itself, we have only the granary, a huge granary with a lot of cereals for the soldiers. You have the fortifications. At Koktepe, you have only the fortification, but we have no houses. We have, again, semi-buried houses. Whenever there are, for instance, in Sazagan, in this area around, they have only semi-buried huts. So I think there was no real colonization. This area always stayed very difficult, very unsettled, and this is why, I guess, Antiochos already, though he was half Sogdian, built this wall along the Kugitangdal, to protect Bactria, the rest of his domain, from the Sogdians. Not because there were nomads coming in. It was the Sogdians themselves were a threat. This would explain why we don't have in Sogdiana this material which is typical of Ai Khanoum during the first half of the 2nd century BC. So we have no grey ware, we have no stamped ware, we have no amphoras. I don't speak of the left one, which is an import from Rhodes, but the other ones with the ring bases are not. We don't have them. We don't have these jugs, very simple jugs with a handle. We don't have these cratères. We don't have all these applied heads in the bottom of the bowls. So all this pottery is missing, and this is why I think that the occupation of Sogdiana, at least the Samarkand area, stopped after Antiochus I. It doesn't mean that all Sogdiana had to split exactly at the same time. Maybe it is possible that in Bukhara it was a little later. This is why you have Tidemus' first imitation, and then in Kesh you had also Kesh or Narshab. You had also a little later. You know, it is all within 2 or 3 decades. But you know, you don't have to think of Sogdiana just quitting the Greco-Bactrian kingdom at the same time, possibly. It doesn't mean also that because we don't have all this material, it is deserted. Of course not. And the material that you had before goes on. So your imitation, your first imitation, could fit very well into this period. Then an important event happened around 150 BC. It is the end of Ai Khanoum, which happened at the same time. We don't really know what is the cause and what is the consequence. At the same time, when we have people coming from the northeast, from the corridor. Michael. So at Ai Khanoum, it is the real end of the period. It is well dated by the end of the emissions of Eucrates I. And so these people come from there, because we have them only in the Dangara area of eastern Bactria. This is the typical pottery of the Xerov cemetery. Wow. And the same pottery, I think, from Ai Khanoum within the same late period. And maybe because of that, and this would explain very well the new imitations from Antiochus, which are in fact with a portrait of Eucratides, because we have suddenly in Afrasiab pottery which is similar to the last pottery we had on Ai Khanoum, with black slip or pseudo-Megarian bowls, sometimes in grey ware. So I don't know how to understand that except by people fleeing from Bactria because they were repelled by these new people coming in, and going to Samarkand because Samarkand didn't have these people. These people didn't go. We have nothing like that, like the Xeroth material in Samarkand. So then in Samarkand you have, pretty much at the same time, all this happened pretty much at the same time. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom collapses, and you have a lot of nomads coming from the north. And the Zarafshan Valley is covered by cemeteries, where you always have this kind of goblets. Here you have kind of evolution of them. And these kind of jugs, sometimes with a pinch spout. These people are probably from the Saka Sarmatian, the prolongation of the Saka, the Sarmatian people, what the sources call Sakarole. And you have examples of them, probably these people, because of their physical type. I mean, they always have a beard, and they have big eyes. They have nothing to do with Asiani, people coming from the east. And again, a representation of one of them. And we know that during the first century AD, the Yuichi archers with really Mongoloid features killed or destroyed or took control of these Sakarole people, as shown by the Halshayan frieze. So what happened is that suddenly Sogdiana is under a new control, the control of the Kangyu. But this probably didn't start until the Yuichi really took over Kushan, the Kushan area. And then Sogdiana, all these different tribes that were living in Sogdiana got under the control, political control of the Kangyu. But the pottery doesn't change at that time. And on the contrary, as you said, we have very nice pottery, and it shows a lot of influences from different areas. Like, for instance, this crater with a kind of a Buddhist representation. We have this kind of pot with a lion head spout. We have three examples of these. You have a lot of these beautiful pottery with a red, I call it a Roman red, because it is different from the Kushan red. It is more orange, more very high quality. But at the same time, you also have low quality with the slip fading away. Sorry, it's not. And it is the first time we have a treasure of Roman coins in Ostroshana, so not very far from Samarkand, dating mostly to the 1st and 2nd century AD. So all these would fit pretty much. We also have a new kind of crater. They are very heavy. The clay is different. It's not as nice as before. And we have these goblets that are on a very high stem and very bad quality slip. All this is pretty much contemporary. And I would date also to this period, so not before the 2nd and maybe not before the 2nd half of the 2nd century, the Koktepa princess grave with a Chinese mirror, which dates probably earlier, but could have been reused and And I did mainly, this is the pottery from this grave. You see, I mean, the bread engobe, the engobe that is not very nice and that runs down. And especially on the right, you have, bottom right, you have this large basin with two handles. And for me, this is very close to pottery that I will show you later. Because a new event happened. We know it's the Sassanid conquest of Bactria up to Chach. And this is a famous relief that France has published already from Afghanistan. And the new pottery that starts at that time is very much, for me, influenced by the Sassanid people. Even if they didn't control politically Sogdiana, their influence was tremendous on the area. So you have a lot of these shapes. You see the engobe usually now starts dripping, etc. And you see on the right the large basin from Koktepe on the bottom right, and it fits rather well within this typology. So this is why I wouldn't date the grave of Koktepe to the 1st century, no, and only to the late 2nd century BC at the earliest. And so, and then we have the first evidence of the commercial activity of the Sogdians. But as you saw, probably, of course, it started earlier under the Kangyu, rather than before, than during the already Afrasiab III. So it's not before the 1st century AD, I would say. Okay, well, I think that this is all. I hope I have been clear. It's very long, I'm sorry. And of course, I mean, all these are subject to critics and to different ideas, but you're welcome to say something.
Okay, so we have time for a few questions before lunch, so if you don't mind, then.
Oh, well, Bertil, thank you very much. Short clarification, perhaps. I didn't understand something. You suggest to date the grave of Koktepe to the 2nd century because of the Sasanian influence, but no. Sasanian 2nd century?
No. Not before the second half of the 2nd century, because the pottery fits very well with the typology of the pottery under Sasanian influence. I don't say that this basin is already under the Sasanian influence, but it's not long before.
But the Sasanian influence starts only in the 3rd?
In the 3rd century. Well, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. My question concerns the period which is late 2nd millennium BC, or like 13th, 12th centuries BC. Yeah. You were talking the emergence of Yaz-type cultures. Suspiciously, at the same time in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, similar events are observed, like which are called Late Bronze Age collapse, right? Do you think these events are interconnected somehow?
Well, it could be. I mean, very often when you have these movements of people, it is due to climatic or environmental changes that make the people go to another place because they don't have enough where they live. So it is possible that there was a big event at that time that made all the people from the northern area to move down south. But I'm not aware of good studies that have been made on the environment at that time that I could rely upon. Do you, Michael?
You're talking about like end of the second millennium?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's true that there seems to be sort of a downsizing in many of these late Bronze Age towns, cities, whatever we call them, around the end of the second millennium. I think the environmental argument would be difficult given how diverse the actual local contexts are, because a rise and fall in temperature and precipitation in an oasis center versus a foothills area really have major different impacts.
Yeah.
But, and I won't say much more because this is obviously many questions for you, but all I would add is that while we do see maybe declines in aggregation, population aggregation, we see not necessarily such a major decline in trade between East and West. And so there's been new research published on the trade of metal ores in the 13th century and 12th century BC, in which case, especially for tin trade and other major ores across Iran, that there doesn't necessarily seem to be a collapse in such trade. So I think we should be careful in equating systemic collapse or systemic decline with the necessary disaggregation of population. I think that those two things should be disentangled.
Yeah.
Thank you. Could you speak to the continuity of clay sources in the production of ceramics?
No, well, for the...
It's not, yeah.
We have no... for Samarkand, we know a good source, which is not very far from Samarkand itself, from Afrasiab itself. But it has been mainly studied for the Islamic period more than for the other periods. And we are now making a lot of studies, petrographic studies, etc., to know the sources of the temper, sources of the clay, etc. But we have not reached, the position of the sources of the clay.
Okay, thank you.
I just had one question, and that is about the transition Saka-Achaemenid that you were talking about. Partly because I want to try to understand why processes of urbanization, why they are always kind of tied to imperial control. Yeah. So thinking about at Koktepe specifically that this sort of happened because of Achaemenid conquest, or whether or not within Saka or by the same token, Turkic or Kushan, Uaja Kushan, these processes of sedentarization and kind of modeling also, to sort of neighboring powers are happening as well, rather than that there's a distinction, right, between a nomadic Scythian or Saka population and sort of the urbanization that occurs in these moments of transition. So that's just thinking about urbanisms in general, whether how that can be applied in this context or not.
Well, we don't really, besides the fortification in Koktepa and Afrasiab, we have almost no knowledge of the society really behind, because excavations were only very small soundings, so we have almost no structure inside the site. So it's very difficult, and the same for Afrasiab.
Okay, so we do two more questions, one here and one here, and then I think.
Here was, yeah, and then you, yeah.
I just had a question about the wheel-thrown pottery and how it related to the hand-built pottery. So you were saying that for a while there was a co-occurrence, and then you get no wheel-thrown pottery, but you have continuations of those hand-built forms. I was wondering if you see any changes in that hand-built pottery, so both in the morphology, like the shape, but also in the way that they're making. So are we seeing more well-made pots, even if they're not wheel-thrown?
Well, they are better made than before.
Yeah.
It's almost obvious on the pictures I showed. But what is interesting is that you find this pottery with the shapes, the new shapes, introduced, but still handmade and with the same temper as before, traditional, in the kurgans. So it really means it's the local traditional pottery of the people, and it stands for a long time, especially in the valleys, in the mountains, etc. And it never changes almost.
Thank you, Bertie. Always very stimulating. And my question actually goes a little bit back to what Sancho had asked. So about this Saka horizon at Koktepa. And you mentioned that there are these parallels with Uigarak and Kuyusai. But in Uigarak and Kuyusai, we also have, especially in Uigarak in early kurgans, the presence of Yastu ceramics. And I wanted to ask you...
Exactly.
Yes.
Tall goblets.
Yes. So how would you date them?
Well, 6th century.
But according to...
Yeah, but then they have no C14 dates. They have a lot of... the dates are also...
So, how do you... where do you stand with regard to the typology that Burovka and Sverchkov made about Yas 2A, Yas 2B, and Yas 3 and the chronology? Yes. Which they date from the middle of the 8th century into the maybe 6th century.
Yeah.
So, and Uigarak is earlier.
Who knows? I mean, we have many problems with this datation of all these, the absolute dates.
Yeah.
We have a lot of problems. No, but I mean, what I say is just, from comparisons, from trying to figure out how can you explain this sudden introduction of fortification with this kind of bricks, etc. At first we all said, well, it could be the local pre-Achaemenid, like we have in Bactria, the pre-Bactrian. But I don't see anything, that could show someone really gathering and having such huge fortifications to be done in this huge gate. And when I looked, I compared with Tole Ajori that Pier Francesco has excavated. I mean, it looks very much similar. Of course, it is not with glazed bricks, like in Mesopotamia. It is made with local bricks, but... Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.